Hi, Madman here. Today we're going to continue our series of physics tutorials in Corona SDK by talking about collision detection. And what I've done is I've set up this simple app. It's just basically got two walls, a floor, and a ceiling, and two platforms, and a ball that I can toss around on the screen, and it bounces on each of these objects. So basically everything is a static physical object with the exception of this ball. So let's talk about collisions and what they are before we continue. Collisions are a special event that Corona uses and can detect, and by detecting a collision you're able to program your app to do something interesting. So what you might use collisions for are like maybe a bullet hits an object and the object explodes, or maybe two objects touch each other and a sound is played, or maybe you've got one object touches another one and you score points. Those are the sorts of things you would do using collision detection, and it's really a basic building block for any sort of game that you might want to dream up. So we're going to, one of the things about collisions is there are three types of collision events that Corona SDK can detect. One is a pre-collision, and that is right before a collision is going to happen, is a pre-collision. And you can do things to sort of prep for something that's going to happen during the collision. The second event is the actual collision event. And then the third event is post-collision. And perhaps you want to, let's say you have a collision between two objects and you want a sound to be played, but maybe you don't want the sound to be played if the collision force is under a certain threshold. That might be something you could do, and you can accomplish that using the post-collision event. Today we're going to focus on just the collision event, however. So I'm going to do two things with this app. One is this ball, when it touches the this blue platform, it's going to gradually fade out for each tap. The other one, this pink platform, as I tap it, it will change to a random color. And then I'll probably do a few more other things to make the app more interesting. We'll just do that as we go along. So let's go ahead and bring up our source code. Let's just do a quick overview of what we have here. It's sort of a review from our previous physics lesson. First thing we do is we hide the status bar, and then we load the physics library using the require physics command. The next thing we do is we start up physics, and then I like to set the gravity kind of high. The default is 9.8 on the y-axis. I like to set it to about 25. It gives the ball a little bit more heft. Next, I have a function called drag body, and this function essentially handles my ability to pick up this ball and drag it around on the screen and toss it. It creates a temporary touch joint on the ball and tracks my finger movements. Next, I've defined all of my display objects, the circle, the walls, the ground, and the platforms. Note that I've created name properties for each of these objects, and I'll explain why I did that fairly soon. And then we have our actual physics bodies. We're adding them to each of our objects. And as I stated, you can see that I have made static objects out of almost everything. The only thing that isn't a static object is the circle, of course, because that has to interact with the other objects. And then finally we have an event listener that reacts to a touch event, and it invokes the drag body function which we've created up here. So let's go ahead and start by creating a runtime event listener. Now, collision events can run either globally or they can run locally. And by that I mean that a global collision event will be something that registers or listens for collisions on any object in the app, where a local one assigns certain objects certain collision event listeners. And local would be used in a situation where you have sort of a one-to-many collision. So you have one hero character and multiple others that would affect the hero. Global might be a many-to-many relationship. I'm going to start off by doing a global event listener just to show you how that's done, and then we're going to do it using a local collision listener. So we're going to start by using the runtime add event listener command, and we're going to listen for a collision event. Remember I told you you could also listen for post-collision or pre-collision, but for this tutorial we're just going to use the collision event. And then I'm going to invoke a function called onCollision. Now I haven't built that function yet, so I'm not going to save it just yet, otherwise I'll get an error. I'm just going to build it right now. So I'm going to put that after drag body, I think. It could go before it, I suppose, but this is where I'll put it. So let's start by creating our function, local function onCollision. You can call this whatever you want. I'm just choosing to call it onCollision. Now note we have to pass the event property here, or the event parameter, to our collision function, onCollision function. Because what we're going to do is we're going to start reading the phases. Now collisions have two phases, either collision, pre-collision, or post-collision. They're all going to have two phases: the began phase, which is when the collision first occurred, and the ended phase, when the collision is no longer happening. So we're going to detect if event.phase is equal to began. So just when the collision begins, what are we going to do? Well, in a global event listener situation where we have a runtime event listener, we need to figure out what two objects collided. And the two objects involved in a collision are going to be tagged as either object 1 or object 2. Specifically, they're going to be tagged as event.object1 or event.object2. So I'm not sure exactly which is going to be object 1 and object 2, so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a print, and I want to print out event.object1 name. I'm going to get the name property of whatever is the object 1 in the collision. And then I'm going to append to that a space and the word and then event.object2.name. So, and then I'm going to end this began phase. And that is just enough to get us started. Let's take a look. So let's see what's going on. Aha! So object 1 appears to be ground and circle appears to be object 2. Let's pick that up and see again. Yes. Let's try the wall. Yep, east wall, west wall, purple P, which is the purple platform, and the blue one. Yeah, blue P and circle. Okay, so object 1 is not the circle, which you might think it would be, but it isn't. Object 2 is the circle. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to replace this now with a statement that's going to change the alpha of object 1. So now the first thing we want to do, since we know object 1 is going to be platform, let's find out what we've called our platform. Platform 1 is blue P. That's the one we want to change the alpha on. So we're going to put another if statement in there, and we're going to check if event.object1.name is double equal to blue P, then we want to change the alpha. Event.object1.alpha equals event.object1.alpha minus 0.2. So we're just going to knock it down by 0.2. And we just end that if statement. and let's see how that goes. Okay, now let's see what happens when we drop this ball on that platform. And yeah, you can see it's being reduced by 20% every time. Now, notice it doesn't go away, which looks a little strange now that it's invisible. Now, let's say we want that thing to disappear whenever the alpha is 0. Let's do that. Let's add another if statement in here inside of our if statement for setting the object alpha. If event.object1.alpha is equal to 0, then event.object1 remove self. So we're just going to remove that object, and we'll just end. Let's take a look and see what happens when we do that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And look at that. Now our blue platform has disappeared. So we got that working. That's great. So let's move on to the next goal, and that is to change this purple pinkish platform to a random color every time it gets hit by the ball. So to do that, we're going to put in an else if to pair up with this if statement. So I'm going to go ahead and insert a line here between these two end statements, and put else if event.object1.name double equal to, what was the name of that object again? It was purple P. Let's grab that. Then what are we going to do? Well, I guess the simplest thing to do would be set the fill color on the object. So event.object1 set fill color. And normally you would put RGB values here, but instead we want to have a random color generated. And we can accomplish that by using the math.random library. Let's do that. Math.random, open paren, close paren, for the first, that's the red value. And then another one, math.random, open, close parens. And then once again, math.random, and that's for the blue value. So this is red value right here. This is green, and that's blue. And we're setting the fill to a value between 0 and 1. Now that's a fractional value, by the way. Now if I wanted a value of 0 or 1 to be generated in one of these rather than a fraction, then I could just put in 1 in here, or 0, 1. That would accomplish that. But if I don't put anything in there, I'm going to get a fraction between the number 0 and 1. So let's see if that works. Let's save it and grab this ball, and let's see what happens. Okay, it's turned sort of gray. Okay, kind of a yellowish brown, bright yellow. This appears to be working just fine. Okay, good. Excellent. Okay, so that's great and all, but let's add a little bit more interest to the app. Why don't we add some sounds? Now we're going to go to the beginning and we're going to instance some variables for our sounds. So the first one we're going to add is a boing sound. And I've got this sound file in my project folder now. Then I'm going to add another sound for this, and that boing sound, by the way, we're going to use that anytime that ball hits the platforms. We're going to use another sound for when the ball hits the floor or the walls. And we're going to call that thud. And then finally, we're going to have another sound called scream. And you'll see what that does at the end of this tutorial. Okay, so now we've instanced our sounds, and the sound files are in our project folder. Here's scream, here's thud, and there's boing. Okay, let's get back to our code. And we're going to put some audio play statements here in our onCollision function. So I told you that for the platforms, if this ball hits a platform, we want to hear a boing sound. So we're going to go into our section there where we say if event.object.one.name is equal to blue p, then we set the alpha accordingly, right? And then we've got this purple p 1, 2. So this is where both objects are detected. So what we're going to do is we're going to just toss in right here an audio.play boing. And we're going to do it for the purple P object as well. Let's try that. Okay, that's working. Of course, when that thing disappears, there will be no more objects to collide with except for the color changing platform. So we've got the boing sound playing. Now, what about all the other objects that it hits, the walls and such? How do we deal with those? Well, what we can do is rather than end this if statement where we're checking the names of the objects, we'll just put an else. So we don't care if it's anything other than blue P or purple P, then we want to play a different sound. Else audio.play thud. So we're going to play the thud sound, and then we're going to end this. Let's see what happens when we do that. There we go. It's kind of like a basketball hitting something. Good. So now that's added a little bit more interest to the app. Okay, great. So that's basically how we implement a global collision listener. Now let's see how we can accomplish the same thing using a local listener. So instead of what we're going to do is we're going to change the name of our function to onLocalCollision, and we're going to pass it two parameters. This time we're going to pass it a self parameter and event. Now we're going to get to what that means in just a few minutes. But let's go down here, and rather than use a runtime, we're going to do this a little bit differently. We're going to start off by assigning event listeners to the actual object. So we start off by defining a custom property for the object. In this case, platform1 dot collision equals, and we're going to that collision property is going to be equated to this function. So we're going to put that function in there. And we're going to do the same thing for platform 2. Okay. Now the next step of this is we add the event listener to our platform. So platform add event listener. So not a global listener, but specifically to the platform 1, by the way. And again, we're listening for a collision event. And instead of invoking that function name up here, we're going to refer back to the actual object we are setting the listener on. And what it does is it looks up that property of collision that we've set up, and then it gets the onLocalCollision function from that property. It's kind of a strange way to do it, but that's how you do it. So we're going to do the same thing with platform 2. We'll listen for a collision, and we're going to refer back to itself, which has the collision property defined on this platform 2. It's on local collision, which is this guy right up here. Okay, so we've got these event listeners, these local collision listeners set up. We need to go back to our onLocalCollision event. Now I mentioned that we needed to pass 2 parameters. We need to pass the self parameter and the event parameter. Now the difference here in global and local collisions as you're making these functions is event.object1 and event.object2 become self and event.other. So event.object1 is going to be self. And so we're going to replace all these event.object1 with the word self. And that's this parameter right up here that we've passed. And let me make sure I get all of them. And finally, else if. We're going to remove that print statement because it's just a bunch of noise at this point. So now what we're doing is we're saying if self.name, meaning the object that is hit, is involved in collision, is blue P, then self.alpha is going to be set to self.alpha minus 20%. And it's going to play that sound, and then if self.alpha ends up being 0, it's going to remove itself. Self, remove self. So let's see how well that works. We're going to save this. And that appears to work. Let's keep going. Let's make sure self, remove self works. Let's bring this ball up here and just drop it and let it bounce. Okay, and that appears to have worked. So let's see what happens when it touches the colored platform here. Let's see. Yep, that's working. Okay, great. Okay, so notice that it doesn't play any sounds whenever it hits the ceiling, the walls, or the floor. Now, to make it play sounds, we're going to have to add more event listeners because now we're not using global event listeners. We're only using event listeners for the objects we care about. Now, maybe we don't want it to play a sound when it hits the floor, but we do want it to play sounds when we hit the ceiling and the walls. How do we do that? Well, we just go down towards the bottom and we create a couple of more event listeners. So we'll do that, and we're going to just make one for east wall and one for west wall, and maybe we'll make one for the ceiling as well. We call it, what do we call it? Roof. Okay, and then we need to change this to east wall. And we need to change that to west wall, change that to roof. And remember, we also have to set up our collision property on our object. So let's do that. Okay, so platform 1 becomes east wall. Platform, okay, I will call that roof, and we'll call this west wall. So now we've set up collision properties on all of the objects we care to detect collisions on. We're still not detecting collisions on the floor though. And what should happen now is we go back to onLocalCollision, we have this else statement. We're detecting to see whether the name of the object is purple P or blue P, and we're going to play a certain sound and do some certain bits of code, change the color of the object or set the alpha. Otherwise, we're simply going to play a sound, and it's going to be the thud sound. So let's save that, and let's see what happens. Now, it doesn't play anything when it hits the floor, and that's because I did not create an event listener for that. Let's go ahead and hit the wall. Yep, that worked. So maybe you probably do want some kind of sound to play on the floor when the ball hits the floor. Maybe you want a different sound. Okay. That's how you implement both kinds of collision listeners, local collision listeners and global collision listeners. So, I hope you found this helpful. Please check out my other tutorials on Madman's mobile app dev channel. And thanks for watching.